Okay, be on your most articulate, wonderful behavior, everybody. So today we're going to talk about a case study of the economic development and the roots of revolution on the US-Mexican border. We're going to look at the case study of a tiny little town, but very historically important, called Tomochic. Tomochic, that's an odd sounding name because it's an indigenous name. It's odd sounding to me, I think. And this is going to coincide with 5 pages from this PDF link you have right here. So just check out pages 165 to 170 and you'll get some background on events leading up to Tomochic and what was happening in that area of northern Mexico, southern United States. And there are 7 questions that go with this that I will help you answer in today's discussion and in the book. Okay. So let me see your wonderful faces. Does that make sense where we're at right now? And you can give me little reactions like this too if you want. Right, little thumbs up. Okay. Let's roll. So again, just as I have you tell me where you got your information, show me your sources, right? This is the source for this lecture. Paul Vanderwood was a great Mexican historian based out of UC San Diego. And he wrote this a few years ago, The Power of God Against the Guns of Government, religious upheaval in Mexico at the turn of the 19th century. And I was actually lucky enough to work with him in Oaxaca when I was down there in 2003. And he's a wonderful man, wonderful, wonderful man. And he and Jeffrey Pilcher got along great. And we had some just great conversations about food and the border. So here's the area of the world we're going to be studying today. It's today right across the Arizona border into Mexico. Right, we're going to talk about the economic development and violence on the border. So there was economic development booming on the US side of the border and the Mexican side of the border at this time, the late 1900s. But as you know, us historians like to have a long wind up, so I'm going to go back in time, and please, Justin, M, or Lee, interrupt me anytime I get tired of hearing my voice. So just come in with a question, even if it's just a canned question. So this is just a peek at the native peoples who were here before various European migrants came in. And the area of the world we're talking about was south of what we were talking about a couple lectures ago. The Pueblo people are up in here. We're talking about the Llano people and the Yaqui people, but there's many other groups down here in this area of the world. Geographically, this area it's a high desert. It's very hot, some of the hottest places, one of the hottest places in the world. But if you have a river that runs through it, this is also part of like the Colorado River Plateau. If you have a river that runs through this area, it's very fertile, very fertile. And if you remember back to our discussions about early California and then early Texas, colonial New Spain tried their darndest to get settlers to come further up north, but most settlers did not want to. They were happy with staying in what's called the Silver Belt down here in central Mexico. And they tried with land grants, just as the United States tried to get settlers to come west through cheaper subsidized land grants. And a handful of colonists took the colonial government of New Spain up on it. And in the 1760s, this little town of Tomochic was founded. And it was founded with Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcalans joined other folks with Spanish descent. And Lee, Emma, or Justin, do you all remember who the Tlaxcalans were or are?
People who helped them, the Spanish, overthrow the Aztecs.
Yeah, exactly, right? And remember, I told you this relationship would last a long time. The main allies that helped the Spanish conquer the Aztecs were the Tlaxcalans, and they're still in alliance with many of, at this time, colonial Spaniards. So in other words, this is a very diverse community made up of native peoples from central Mexico moving north. They're surrounded by native peoples in northern Mexico and also folks of Spanish descent. And again, they weren't dumb. Where are you going to found a settlement in the sparsely populated dry north? Well, right on a sweet river. And here's some sweet agricultural lands. This is Tomochic River today. So for about 100 years, the people in Tomochic practiced local politics, self-governance. They practiced their religiosity, their popular form of Christianity. And they're economically far away from Mexico City. Like many Westerners in the United States, they were fiercely independent, right? A lot like we were talking about the fiercely independent Californianos and Tejanos. For example, when practicing their religion, what's the role of priests for Catholics during, say, baptism, marriage, and death? What's the role of a Catholic priest during these formative times in your life? Justin, Emma, or Lee?
They basically preside over it, and they basically are kind of in charge, and I kind of like MC it, I guess, in a way. Like they're the ones that are gonna be up in front doing all the talking or most of it.
No, you're exactly right, Justin. They're the intermediary between, right, the mother church, according to Catholics, right? Mother church will help you get to heaven and help you fight the evils that are here all around us in the world. So you need a priest to baptize your child when it's born. You need a priest to preside and sanctify your marriage. You need a priest to see over your last, right, when you die. However, there's no priests up here. There's no official priests. So do you think these folks are just going to go all secular or atheist and not practice religiosity? Lee, I saw you slightly nod your head. How do you think they're going to do baptism, marriage, and death with no priests?
By themselves.
Yeah, exactly. This is called lay religious orders, or it's called just popular Catholicism. And they're going to choose, right? They're going to kind of elect, small d democratic, somebody, and they do. So for over 100 years, they practice baptism, marriage, and death with somebody they choose as being their representative of the church, even though it's not sanctified by the official church. This is going to be important later. I'm not just mentioning it to show you this cool picture of the people of Tomochic. Right, look at her rocking the guitar. I bet that's some good music she plays. I would love to hear recordings, but they do not exist for this early. So the people of Tomochic had a local militia. Of course, this is not the local militia. These are a bunch of young men with pretend guns. But who do you think the local militia is going to be fighting against in this northern part of Mexico? Where do the main dangers come from?
The natives.
Yeah, right. They are surrounded by native folks who've been there for thousands of years, who are experiencing the trauma of all of a sudden, Spaniards coming north. They experienced the trauma of people like Oñate. We talked about 100 years previous, enslaving them and kidnapping them and taking them down to the mines of central Mexico. So the Apache, Yaqui, Tehuecos, and Tarahumaras are not really happy they're around. So therefore, they have a long experience, right, keeping their internal domestic security themselves. This will be important later too. So in conclusion, before I go over to the next chapter, these northerners in the town of Tomochic and many other towns in the north were fiercely independent and had practiced, right, basically subsistence economies, right, in which they grow their own. They politically, they take care of situations locally and their own unique form of popular religion. However, come the late 1800s, remember last time we spoke about the US-Mexican War? What was the state of Mexico during the US-Mexican War? And I'm talking about like its political
chaos, because like Mexico or Texas had just broken off, and there's a lot of like different presidents that were coming in and out, so it was in strife.
Yeah, it was complete chaos in Mexico. Regional fights over who's going to control this huge amalgam of people called Mexico, right? It was basically Mexico just on paper. until President Porfirio Diaz rises to the presidency, and I use the presidency in air quotes. He rose as a military commander. He is a bilingual mestizo man. His mother was from Tehuantepec. She was a Zapotec woman. His father was a man of Spanish descent, and he spoke Spanish kind of like a hick. I don't mean that in a bad way. He spoke Spanish kind of poorly, like a country guy. Yet he rose to power because of his military prowess. He was a brilliant tactician and had a very loyal Zapotec army that he led. So he was able to centralize power in Mexico, and his motto was order and progress. And how did he achieve that order and progress? Well, through the old Spanish saying, he offered you plata o plomo. And I forget, Justin, Emma, or Lee, do any of y'all speak a little bit of Spanish? You know what that means?
I do, but I'm not exactly sure.
Sure.
Hablo no español, but I'm guessing it's going to be something like a stick and a carrot, something like that.
Exactly right, right. We have our own English version, right? A stick or a carrot, bread or lead. This means silver, plata. So he offered you either bribes in the metaphorical sense of silver. So if you're a regional boss, right, when we talk about the drug wars in a couple months, there's going to be a lot of similarities to the Mexican Revolution, and this is why I bring it up. So you could either agree to be on the side of Porfirio Diaz and his new federal police force, or you would get lead. Plomo means lead. You'd get a bullet to the head. So one of the ways in which he did centralize power was he created this police force, which was answerable only to him. It wasn't answerable to any other institutions.
I have a question.
His power is around the person of him. So you're going to also see when he falls from power in assignment 3, we'll talk about that. It's just going to dissolve, and Mexico's going to go into a decade-long revolution.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So do you think that he might have kind of set up that general like attitude that even today like continues with the Mexican mafia? Because that's kind of like the whole thing with a lot of the cartels, right? In general, like that's kind of what they do even to this day, right?
That's exactly right. Once this political party that had ruled for 70 years lost an election in the year 2000, so the head was cut off of the beast, and all these different regional groups started to fight over each other, started to fight over territory, started to fight over one of the #1 exports to the United States, drugs. Yes, so you're exactly right, Justin. It's very, very similar. And many Mexican historians point that out, and we'll be talking about that. So how did Porfirio Diaz buy off his allies, all these regional strongmen who had many, guys with guns who were loyal to them? What Porfirio Diaz did was he privatized land, communal land holdings that were either owned by the church, by different indigenous groups. And if you'll remember, during the colonial era, one of the ways in which the colonial government of New Spain negotiated with the indigenous groups was allowed them to own big chunks of land together, right? Kind of like reservations or version. And he privatized many colonial land grants. You had to come to government offices and show the government your papers. A lot like Mariano Vallejo in California had to go and prove that he owned his land when the United States took over California. So he privatized a lot of the lands, and this is mostly an excuse to show you this great landscape portrait by one of Mexico's best landscape portrait painters, right? You can see Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl in the background there, and this is a big hacienda. That's just their word for big ranch. And you see the corn and the maguey plants over here. So he's going to privatize these lands in the name of order and progress. He wants to modernize Mexico. So who's going to come in and buy some of the lands? Well, some international folks. Many wealthy Americans came in and bought lands at a subsidized, cheaper price. And the Guggenheim family, for example, ran a silver mine right south of the border, and it pulled out a lot of silver. And the deal the Mexican government made with the Guggenheims was that, hey, you have to pay low tax and we can offer you cheap land and labor, and you give me some kickbacks, and boom, it's a win-win situation. But who do you think it's not a win-win situation for?
The laborers?
Yeah, the laborers there. It's basically slave labor. Oftentimes they were paid with company script, which means just like money you can only use at the Guggenheim store. And of course, the Guggenheim store's price for coffee and sugar and everything else was highly inflated. And just a couple other examples of how the land and the wealth was concentrated in the north for the first time. Remember, colonial New Spain had a heck of a time getting settlers to come to the north. But once the region started to develop, the Teresa family, this is a wealthy Mexican family still around. Their family today is one of the main heads of the northern drug cartels we'll talk about later. They own 7 million acres. It's almost hard to think about that. It's in the state of Chihuahua today. The wealthy American William Randolph Hearst owned 1 million acres in northern Mexico. So just these vast areas of land. And in the end, a small, tiny portion of Mexicans and a handful of foreigners ended up owning most of the good arable land in Mexico. And I'm telling you this because this is really going to upset people and trigger what will become the Mexican Revolution and the Tomochic Rebellion. On the other hand, not just to critique Diaz, there was development, right? There was development for the first time of railroads. If you'll remember when we spoke about the US-Mexican War, there were hardly any railroads or canal systems in Mexico. By 1910, the Porfirio Diaz regime and British railroad companies had built 12,000 miles of railroads, right? Connecting the east and west coast, connecting north and south. And check it out, our place Tomochic right here is now gonna be connected for the first time to the outside world. All right. And Tomochic's not only going to be connected to the outside world, but it links up with this network of Southern Pacific railroads to the United States. So again, this is why Mexican-American history or the history of the borderlands is so important to, I think, understand we're so connected, right? Economically, culturally. Justin wants to go eat some mole, so do I now. How do you think this is going to change life for those folks in Tomochic who are used to like over 100 years of very little interaction with the federal government? How do you think this is going to change stuff? What do you think, Lee, Justin, or Emma? How do you think this is going to change their life? Give it a gander, Lee.
Well, now they're going to have a lot more access to different products and goods that they're going to be able to receive, and they're also probably going to be able to ship out their goods to more people to purchase them.
Oh, you're right. In the perfect world, that might have happened, right? Lee, I love your, Justin, I love your optimism. Keep it up. Actually, what ended up happening during this era, let me back up a little, during this era, the US and the Mexican economies were booming. If you looked at like the macroeconomic graphs, everything's going up. In the 1910s, for the first time, Mexico City experienced, lit itself up. It had a big old coming out party. And Mexico City had this big, big celebration in which they lit it all up. Sorry, Justin, but what actually happened was there was a lot of profit for the few and poverty for many, many. And if you look at economic patterns in the United States during this time, and you take my 17B class, there's a parallel between the Gilded Age. When you look at US history, this era is called the Gilded Age, in which a few monopolists made a lot of money and many workers did not. So let's focus in on Tomochic. And again, it's just an excuse to show you this pretty cool picture. Is that image kind of fuzzy? Can you all make it out? Lee, Justin, and Emma? Yeah. Look at the guy with the glasses. Oh man, old school sunglasses. I don't know the history of sunglasses, but that must have been some of the first sunglasses. Look, and they're showing off that they're drinking newly bottled soda pop here. I'd give anything to hear that band. However, how did this play out in Tomochic? Well, a lot of Tomochicos couldn't produce their colonial land grant titles. They didn't have the paperwork. So those who did not have the paperwork, federal authorities came in and sold their land to others. So they became landless, all right? So what happens when you become landless or you can no longer work the wonderful, fertile agricultural fields? You go get a job, right? You go get a job that'll cut you a check, and sure, the check's not going to be that much if you're working on the railroad, in some of the mines, or some of the very large scale agriculture that's happening. Pretty soon, this is going to be the source of a lot of cotton production in Mexico, the northern region. However, let me give you an example of copper mining. The Cananea copper mine is just outside Tomochic, and the Cananea copper mine to this day is one of the biggest copper mines in the world. You can see it from space. Here is the town of Cananea down here. If you can see all those square grid pattern cities, and look how big this open pit mine is from space. It's huge if you can see those little towns down there, that little town. And here's the leach reservoir, all the nasty tailings from, kind of like we have at Iron Mountain. All the highly toxic, nasty tailings are right down there. So many Tomochicos said, you know what, I gotta put food on the table. I gotta go find a job at the mine. The problem was, even though you are earning a wage, there was a dual wage system. For example, if you were an American who worked there, and there were many Americans who worked on the mine, they came over for the job. If you were an American and you worked as an engineer at the mine, and if you were a Mexican working as an engineer and you had the exact same job, the American was paid more. And this went across the board, right? Same job, a dual wage system, whether you were from Mexico or whether you were from the United States. Another problem workers faced there was this boom-bust cycle, right? You know how capitalism has had a boom-bust cycle ever since our nation has started. So during bad times, Mexicans would get laid off and not Americans. And many Mexican workers at this Cananea mine were very upset. So what do you think many workers did at the Cananea mine to protest against this dual wage system and the boom-bust cycle? What do you think, Lee?
Went on strike.
Yeah, just like workers throughout the United States in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, workers across the United States and Mexico went on strike. It was when they could, right, pressure bosses with their bodies, right? No longer, this was before the recognition of any unions. So look at, are those the Cananea miners? Can you tell those are women? So it's the female family members of the strikers who went and put their bodies right on the line in front of the Cananea mine. Why do you think so? Why do you think the wives and the daughters and the grandmothers of the miners were the one to put their bodies on the line?
Probably less likely to touch them and move them than if they were men. At least I would assume. I'm sure they still would, but probably at least a little bit of a
No, you're exactly
with,
right.
Moving someone out of the way.
Lee, do you agree? Emma, do you got a thumbs up on that one? Thumbs up. Exactly. Authorities, because remember, this is a time where journalists are roaming around everywhere. This is the borderlands. The Cananea mine was a very famous and highly productive mine. Our economy needed the copper for the Cananea mines to string all the telegraph line, etc. So the Mexican army is a lot less likely to mow these women down, right, and imprison them because they're women. A similar thing's going to happen during the Mexican Revolution, right? Mexican women putting their bodies on the line because in this patriarchal society, less likely to get mowed down. So here's my long windup. Before I move on to Teresa Urrea, Any questions or comments so far? Lee, Justin, or Emma?
At some point you said that this was kind of before there was like any unions backing them up on the strikes. About what time like did that become more common for unions for like minor workers and stuff?
Okay, the rise in federally recognized and protected unions was the 1930s, late 20s, early 30s.
Okay.
And that's the same in the United States. The Wagner Act of 1935, the federal government recognized workers' rights to unionize in the United States, right? And what that means is that the federal authorities will protect workers against, right, thugs of the management.
Before then, there was mass violence against people striking in America, including like a pretty notorious straight up massacre.
Yeah, whether you're talking about the Haymarket Massacre
Uh,
in Chicago?
I was talking about the one where I believe the National Guard attacked a bunch of miners in, I believe, West Virginia.
No, yeah, that was Pennsylvania, the Molly Maguires. You're exactly right. No, but there's numerous examples. Oh my gosh. In my, maybe afterwards, I'll show you a map of all the mining violence. And even here in the North State, copper miners went on strike right outside of Reading, and there was violence there as well. Emma, did you want to chime in?
Oh no, that answered my question. Thank you.
Okay. I just saw the green thing surrounding your screen and it got me excited. Okay. So into this is born Teresa Urrea. Teresa Urrea's dad was the owner of this big ranch, right? A Spanish-speaking owner of the big ranch, wealthy family from northern Mexico. Her grandfather was one of the founders of Culiacan. Culiacan is the capital of Sinaloa, the hometown of my grandfather. So her dad was the rancher, and her mom was his 14-year-old domestic worker who was a native, a Tehueca. Tehueca is not her name. It's the native people she was, it's her native tribe. So she was an illegitimate mestiza, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way. I mean that her dad took advantage of the 14-year-old domestic servant. We have no idea if it's consensual, but we know he was the guy in power. And Teresa was born. At the age of 12, after being raised by her indigenous mother, right? She was bilingual, spoke Spanish and Tehueca. Her mother disappears from the record. We don't know if she died or took off, or we don't know what happened to her. But she was raised by a curandera. And here's, see if you can Google off. Anybody know what curandera means in Spanish?
Like a healing woman, basically.
Yeah, somebody who cures. It's the same Latin root as the word, the English word to cure, curandera. So a local indigenous curandera raised her up, taught her the medicinal ways of indigenous folks in northern Mexico, whether that it was using, rattlesnake skin or a cow's stomach lining to cure, various local medicinal techniques. And at 16 years old, she was raised a tomboy. She loved to ride horses. She loved to play out in the back and dig in her garden and raise the pigs, right? She was just a northern, kind of like a ranch woman, right? A ranch woman, young woman. But at the age of 16, she started to have convulsions. In fact, she went into a coma for a number of weeks, and it seemed so dreadful that her father even ordered her a coffin. However, after a few weeks in a coma, she comes out of it and said she keeps having visions of the Virgin Mary, who she calls her little nanita, her little nanny. And having visions of the Virgin Mary at this time was nothing new. It was the late 1800s. People are having millennial fears. Every 100 years when the calendar turns over, many Christians start to freak out and think something weird's going to happen. And she started to say she could predict the future and that she could cure people, okay? And as I said, this is a drawing from the early 1900s from the border area in Mexico. And it just captures the fact that many Mexicans in this area are starting to say that the Virgin Mary appeared to her. So that's what I mean, visions of the Virgin Mary, right? They have a vision that She appeared in the cactus, right? Or in the pond reflection or somewhere, right? And it would almost immediately, an altar would be put there and they would venerate her. She got so popular that a journalist from the New York Journal, which is their version of the New York Times back then, very popular newspaper, went all the way down there to interview her. And in the 1889, 1992, she was getting thousands of visitors every day from across Mexico, from across the United States, even some from Europe would come and see her in the hopes of being healed of their malady, whether it was a broken leg or whether it was mental depression. She was receiving hundreds of letters a day, and this was just, it was something that made the paper, right? It's a big deal. However, if this is the only thing she did, I would not be lecturing about her, because during this time there were many healers throughout Mexico and the Catholic world, right? Many folks claimed to be healers, and they attracted huge audiences. And if you have any examples of ones that you know about, please, I'd love to hear about them. But what sets her apart was not only did she heal when she had these crowds of thousands of people a day coming to visit her, she would also get political. She spoke against the evils of this new profession called, this new profession of doctors, right? She would say what the tools that the doctors used were barbaric and they were the instruments of the devil, right? So she also spoke against the evils of money. Remember, a wage-based economy was relatively new in the North, right? For over 100 years, most folks in the North lived on a subsistence or a trade-based economy. She spoke spoke against money, said it was foreign, evil, and it tore communities apart. This is an image of a wealthy neighborhood in Mexico City. She spoke against the secularization of marriage. And what do I mean by that? That's a big word. Here's your word of the day, awkward sound. What do I mean by the secularization of marriage, birth, death, school?
Detaching it from
Not
the church.
religious.
Yep. And what did you say, Justin? I didn't catch that.
This is just not religious.
Yeah. So until this time, the Catholic Church took care of all marriages. They kept track of your marriage certificate. The priest went and presided over your marriage. You didn't need a civil servant to sign something to legitimize your marriage. When you were born, the Catholic Church kept track of it. You didn't need to go get a birth certificate from Shasta County. When you died, the Catholic Church kept track of it. If you were lucky enough to go to school, you went to a Catholic school, right? And throughout the Latin American world. But what's happening now in the United States and in Mexico is that the state's taking over these, taking these over. And it caused a lot of tension both in Mexico and the United States. So she was completely against the state doing what was traditionally the practice of the church. Excuse me. And she got also all economic. She spoke against the progress for the few. Here's an image of Guggenheim, that guy I showed you earlier. We talked about his silver mine, and here's an image of his daughter on a bunch of silver, right? She's on top a stack of silver. And she spoke in sympathy for the poverty of the most. Here's another kid, right, who's a silver miner. And what's more, she said, God's going to come down and punish the sinners, including members and supporters of the godless government. Woo! So, how do you think the Mexican government and the Catholic Church is going to respond to this woman who has a huge audience? What do you think, Lee, Justin, or Emma?
They're probably gonna like call her a heretic or something.
Yep, exactly. The Catholic Church is going to excommunicate you. And what that means in the Catholic Church talk is you're going to hell, right? If you're excommunicated from the church, you're no longer in their communion, right? Their community. And here's the rather somber looking Archbishop of Mexico at the time. And you can always tell with folks of Spanish descent, how important they think they are, is how many names they keep. Because he wants to tell you who his grandmother and great-grandmother are and everybody else. So the longer the name, the more powerful you probably are and pompous. And what President Porfirio Diaz did, here he is later in life. I showed you a younger picture earlier. He sent his troops to go inside the Tomochic church and destroy their religious figures. So straight up vandalizing the Tomochic church. Tomochic church. Okay, 12. What's more is Mexico City newspapers started to really tease what they call these hicks from northern Mexico. So here's a very pro Porfirio Diaz newspaper, what it wrote in January of 1890 about the folks in Tomochic and Teresa Urrea. They wrote, "This is certain, she is no saint, but the result of the highest ignorance. There is no hypnosis, only a young girl imprisoned by nervous attacks and a multitude of imbeciles who pay her tribute because of a lack of intelligence. Saints do not belong to these times. Their age is past, and fortunately for the honor of civilization and progress, they will never return." Boom, totally ripping on like the country hillbillies, right? And if that wasn't enough, here is the photograph, the drawing that accompanied the article. This is the depiction of these just backwards, quote unquote, non-intelligent people from Tomochic. So faced with the federal government destroying your religious relics, the church coming down on you, what do you think the people of Tomochic did? What do you think, Lee, Justin, or Emma? Take a guess.
Declare their independence and
Ooh,
say
like
screw
Texas,
you.
like Texas and California. I like it. Yeah, they rebelled. They locked and loaded. Remember, I told you they had a long history of defending their own. So the Tomochic Rebellion started in December 91. A local indigenous group who was equally upset with policies of the Porfirio Diaz regime, the Yaquis, and if you want to look into a very interesting group of northern Mexican native peoples, look up the Yaquis. They joined the rebellion against the Mexican state. There was a mass, right, in which everybody was told to bring their gun, and their gun would be blessed at this mass. The lay priest, remember, lay means not the official priest. He didn't have part of the Catholic Church card. Cruz Chavez held a mass, and in the mass, he said in part, "The sons of Satan are upon us," meaning the government officials. He said, "Viva la Virgen, long live the Virgin, death to Lucifer," again, the government. Quote, "We do not recognize government authority. We obey no one but God. Viva Santa Teresa, long live the healer." And despite its early success against federal troops, during this time, Teresa fled. Despite its early success, federal troops simply outnumbered them. They came up using the railroad, right? So rather quick access with this modern development of the railroad. They surrounded Tomochic, and in the name of order and progress, destroyed the city, killed many of the able-bodied men and many of the women and children as well. And by November of 92, the government crushed the rebels. So it lasted about 11 months, and the rebellion in Tomochic ended. And even though the town was destroyed, and this is an actual photograph of the dead Tomochicos, journalists wanted to take images of it because, again, this was an internationally known city because of the healer who lived there, Teresa. So even though the town was destroyed and the rebellion was crushed, rebellions like what happened in Tomochic started to flare up all over Mexico because of the heavy-handed policies of the Mexican government and because of the shift in land use, right, and the land privatization. Here's a famous image of the Mexican Revolution in which you see a diverse group of Mexicans, from like whiter looking Mexicans to darker indigenous looking Mexicans to this wealthy northern rancher, Pancho Villa, right, coming together and sitting on the seat where Porfirio Diaz once sat. You see how he borrowed the Prussian symbols of power, the eagle. And this is the beginnings of the Mexican Revolution. And this is a map. All the little dots show the signs of the heaviest rebellions. And there's a direct correlation between the sites of the heaviest rebellions and where land was taken away from communal land holdings. Okay. What happened to Teresa? Well, she escaped. She fled into the United States as a refugee of war. She went to San Francisco to practice healing. Of course she did, right? San Francisco, a long time place for people of, non-traditional beliefs and actions, yay, San Francisco. Then she moved south to LA. And then when she worked in LA, she spent the last years of her life supporting farm workers' rights, Mexican-American and Filipino-American farm workers' rights in LA. Okay. In the interest of time, and because I could go on speaking about Teresa, I want to open it up to you all. Let me just go in the order of what I see. Lee, Justin, or Emma, what struck you about my little discussion, and do you have any questions? Emma, let me pick on you first. What struck you about this tale of rebellion and healing?
It's not very articulate, but Teresa was just really cool.
Wouldn't this make a great movie? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I just want to know all about her.
Okay, well, geez, I'll let you borrow the book. I'll go drop it off on your front porch. We'll COVID distance. Yeah, she was an amazing woman who was raised hearing a lot of the local indigenous mixed with Christian stories about healing, about local medicines, right? She was also a midwife, right? Partera. She is very cool. And you can, I think if you Google this article, I can send it to you, the article from the New York Journal about her life. She is very cool, right? And look at her getting all political too. She's like, uh-huh. Who wouldn't think those barbarous... Go ahead.
I had a question. The previous slide, it talks about secularization of like different stuff. Does
Yep.
that mean she was for separation of church and state?
Yeah, she wanted, remember how I told you there wasn't much of a relationship between the official Catholic Church and Tomochic anyway? So the local people in Tomochic kept track of their own marriage, birth, and death by themselves, and they schooled themselves, right? There wasn't a presence of an official Catholic Church up there. And she was against the federal government coming in and imposing their ways. Like you had to go tell the local commissioner if you were married or the local commissioner if you're dead. Does that make sense?
Cool.
That's a great question because I did say, yeah, I can see why you were, that's a good question. Justin or Lee, what struck you about this? Or you have any questions?
I guess what struck me is just that what's old is new and what's new is old kind of a thing. I mean, it's just the age-old strife between religion and like secularism in a way, and modernism and versus tradition. It's kind of still a thing that's going on even today, and that happens all the time.
Oh my gosh, I used to teach a whole class in Mexican history. My theme was tradition versus modernity. So you nailed it. Hey, bumper sticker, Justin, bumper sticker. All right, Lee, what about you? What struck you about this, or do you have any comments?
I haven't really heard much about the Mexican Revolution before this, but it's interesting to hear that it was basically a labor movement.
For sure. So it was a cross-sectional movement. Urban laborers rose up, students rose up, campesinos, who are farmers, rose up. This is a powerful painting. We'll talk more about the Mexican Revolution, assignment 3. A cross section of Mexicans rose up against the regime of Porfirio Diaz. And I think, hey, here's an image I think that captures it. You have a middle-class guy right here, right? Educated middle-class guy. You have this wealthy watermelon farmer, Emiliano Zapata, right here, teaming up with this northern rancher, Pancho Villa, right? And they came together because they had a common enemy in Porfirio Diaz. What's going to happen after Porfirio Diaz leaves for Paris, he leaves for Paris, France, soon after this, is they're going to start all fighting amongst themselves, right? A lot like drug war 1.0, right? We're in Mexican Revolution 2.0 with the current fight over power today. Yeah. All right, let me stop